Okay, I promised I'd put together a video going over all the traps, how they work, and some tips and tricks on each of them. So let's go ahead and get into that. Easiest way to look at all the different traps that are available is just to pop into your collection book. So we'll click on traps right here. 3 different types: wall, ceiling, and floor traps. And then there are some mission-specific ones that are a little weird. Things like um, the the launchers. So I'll go into those separately. And then, for example, there's some missions where you have to put down tracks, and they'll give you those in the mission. However, let's first start by taking a look at the different stats that are on a specific trap. So let me look at this one here, and I'm going to be going through all of the uncommon version of these traps so you can get a bit of a comparison. But basically the way traps work is they will do a certain amount of damage per hit per time that they strike. There is a delay, so the arming delay between you putting it up on a wall or a floor or ceiling and how long it'll take before it actually arms and then fires. Most of them have a fairly low arming delay, so it's really not that big a deal. The more important figure here is the reload time. So how long does it take for the trap to reload after it fires? As all of these traps, you basically want them to go off kind of continuously, and some traps take a very long time to reload, so other traps don't. Other traps fire fairly often. If the trap does stun, then this is the amount of time that they would be stunned. If the trap can critical hit, this is the chance that they can critical hit, and of course the amount of damage that the critical hit can do. And then lastly, the durability. And the durability is basically how often the trap can fire. Every time a trap fires, the durability will decrement by 1. So, for example, this one is 34. It fires once. Next time it'll be 33. Next time it'll be 32, etc., etc. And by the time the trap gets down to 0, it'll simply just pop off the wall or pop off the floor, and you can then put down another one. Another thing that's pretty annoying about traps is you cannot remove a trap once placed, you cannot put another trap over the top of it, and you cannot repair or refresh the durability of a trap. Once that trap is down, it's down unless you break the surface that's underneath it. So for example, in this case, this is a wall trap. If I put it up on a wall, the only way to get rid of it is 1, use it until the durability's gone, or 2, break the wall that's underneath it. This is a wall darts trap. Basically, you put it on a flat surface, a flat wall. And then one of the things that's interesting about this particular trap is that this trap will engage husks up to 3 tiles away. So within a straight line in front of this trap, as long as it has line of sight, which means it can fire over low pyramids, it can fire over low walls. And as long as the trap can see the husk, it will fire down up to three tiles away, which is kind of cool. So if you're building a trap tunnel, this is a good one to place further in at a location where you've got at least 2 to 3 tiles worth of traps in front of it, where the husks are walking down that tunnel. That way you'll also hit more often, because the trap will be able to fire more often. Okay, next type of trap is a wall electric trap. So this trap does quite a lot of damage. You'll see though that it has a much longer reload time, so up to 12 seconds to reload, which can be quite a lot of time. And it does do a kind of a micro stun, that it'll cause the husks to stutter step as they're going through. Of course, it does have a critical chance. This trap, one of the really, really cool things about this trap is this trap can be placed on a low wall. So you can also place it on a full wall or a 2-height wall, but this is a great trap to basically line your tunnels with, because you can place an item on the floor, and then even if you're using low walls in order to be able to get in and out of the kill tunnel, you can pop these guys on the walls and create a really, really deadly tile. All right, next up is the wall launcher. So the wall launcher is basically a trap that you put up on a wall, and as a husk moves onto the tile that it's in front of, it will basically, like spring-loaded, knock the husk back. If there's another wall behind the husk, it'll knock the husk into that wall and stun them for a few seconds. If it's open, It will knock the husk, in my experience, and it may have to do with this impact rating. I'm not sure exactly how that works, but it will knock the husk up to 2 to 3 tiles away, which is pretty great. So this is one of the ways that I create an infinite loop trap, by basically creating, having husks move up onto a surface and then knocking them off of it, so that in order to get back to where they were, they have to kind of run around through other traps and then back up. One of the big disadvantages of this trap, though, is of course it has a pretty low durability to start. So when I do run an infinite loop trap, this one will definitely break, and so I keep a reserve of these available so that I can run in and throw another one up on the wall. All right, next up is the wall lights trap. Wall lights basically have an engagement range of 1 tile in front of it, and it basically stuns. So, and when it fires, and again, it's got a pretty high reload time, very similar to the wall Dynamo, but when it does fire, it will stun or stop a husk there for a few seconds, so 2.5 seconds. It has a fairly low number of charges, and it only has an effect of about 1 tile in front of it, which is a little unfortunate. It would be nice if this one actually had a slightly larger range, and you could place it, for example, in a adjacent wall that can see over a low wall, but unfortunately it doesn't do that. One of the other things that's a little weird is this trap cannot crit, and for some reason, depending on the recipe that you get or the schematic that you get, you'll see that a lot of these traps for some reason are randoming with crit damage on them, which makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, because this is a trap that cannot really crit. Perhaps over time I could see them changing this to where it could crit, but the stun time increases depending on crit, so crit like adds time to the stun, which would be pretty awesome. But I like using these because I also like using floor spikes, and so this keeps the in certain locations, this will keep the floor spikes and then gas traps on top. This will keep the husks in location a little longer, so that those traps can fire a few more times while on the tile. Or also, if I'm trying to do a trap where I've got a wall launcher or something like that, and I'm trying to launch husks off of a tile, and so I want them to stay there until the trap is recharged and fired. But of course, it's got the same problem where it's got a pretty long reload time itself. All right, and then let's look at the last trap type, and this is a wall spikes trap. Basically, this is very similar to the wall Dynamo, where you can place it on any size wall from a 1 high, 2 high to 3 high. And for whatever reason, this one doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but it does have a reload time. So it would make more sense to me if this trap, because what this trap does is it basically, as husks hit it, they will take damage. So it basically is a kind of a damage return or a damage reflection. But it's really not terribly effective, because it would be more effective if you could funnel them towards a specific wall that you want them to break. But because it's got a reload time, it may not actually hit all of the husks, or may not return damage to all of the husks that are doing damage to it before it actually runs out of durability, which is fairly high. And of course it does have a relatively low reload time, but if you can imagine 2 or 3 husks bidding on this at the same time, they're going to be hitting it more than once every 2 seconds. So again, in my opinion, this is one of the worst traps that's out there. Alright, let's move on to ceiling traps. Ceiling electric field. This is a pretty cool trap because it does AoE damage. So it'll do an area of effect in about a 3x3 tile range. So if you imagine this one in the center, and then it will hit basically all of the tiles surrounding it. There is, however, one caveat. So this trap appears to only fire or only trigger when a husk is directly beneath it. So even though it can engage, so a lot like the wall arrow launcher that we saw earlier, where it can see and fire up to 3 tiles ahead, this one can only be triggered if the husk is directly underneath it. So it's a little more difficult to place. I like putting it at the front of my tunnels, so as husks are aggregating or moving into the tunnel, usually they're they're not quite centered yet, and so this way you can hit all of the ones in the tile slightly surrounding it. Or I also like putting it kind of in the middle of my kill tunnels, because then as the husks are moving along, usually there'll be a string of husks behind them, and so the first one that triggers this will at least trigger a 2-tile damage. And this one does have a fairly low reload time, which is pretty cool. Okay, next up, the ceiling zapper. This is very similar to the one we just looked at. The big difference is this one only affects a single tile. Right, so a husk moves underneath this thing will fire. But much like we saw with a lot of the ones, the previous wall traps, it's got a pretty long reload time. So this thing is not firing all that often. And then lastly, my favorite, which is the ceiling gas trap. So the ceiling gas trap creates an AoE cloud, so that will it'll only cover a single tile, but it'll do damage to all of the husks that are within that tile. This is great for tunnel entrances or any place where you're going to have a lot of husks aggregating together. It's got a fairly short reload time, and then it appears to me like the linger time on the gas itself is pretty long. So once it fires, the damage over time effect seems to be up throughout the entire time that the husks are in the space, which is pretty great. All right. Lastly, the floor traps. Floor launcher is very similar to the wall launcher. The big difference is you put it on the floor, and then as a husk moves over the top of it, it will launch them straight up into the air. The one drawback to this trap that I have noticed is that if a husk is moving along the edge of this trap, it doesn't appear to always trigger. So the husks do need to move along the center of the trap in order to guarantee that it's going to fire. And it will also launch the husks pretty much straight up and down. You can put an angled surface above it. So for example, you could have a wall and then another angled surface, and then redirect them, but I have not found that to be super reliable. And you could also use, if you've got a long enough tunnel, you could also use partial walls. So 2 tiles ahead, you could use a partial wall on the left, and then right in front of this, you could use a partial wall on the right, and that should more or less center the husks as they're entering this particular tile. But again, I'm not that thrilled with it. The one nice thing about this, though, is it does have enough impact that it does, even if you're just knocking them straight up and down, it does seem to stagger them, so it does act a little bit like a stun. Okay. Floor spikes. Pretty good traps. Basically, they just, as husks move over the top of them, it'll launch basically a bunch of spikes out of the ground that impale them. Does pretty good damage, has pretty good reload time. So you can see here that 6 seconds on the reload time, which overall makes this a pretty great trap. All right, next up is my favorite floor trap. These are the wooden floor spikes. They do not do a ton of damage, so they don't actually do that much damage, but they fire fairly frequently, so 2.2 seconds, which an average husk takes about that long to move across this floor anyway. But the more important thing, to me anyway, is that it also slows enemies that move over the top of it. So and I'm not sure what the slowing percentage is, but it seems to have a pretty big effect on the husks as they move over the top of this, where they will slow down and basically stay in your kill zone longer. So then if you use this to slow the husks that are moving across the floor, put a couple of wall dynamos and then a gas trap over the top of them, this can be a pretty deadly tunnel segment. Healing pads, of course it's called a trap because we place it the way that we do a trap, but basically this will create a small healing pickup that a player can run over the top of and pick up, and it'll heal them for a certain amount depending on how high you've leveled up the trap. It does have a fairly long reload time, which is a little unfortunate, so if you've taken a lot of damage, you may have to come to this trap, pick up some health, leave, come back, or stand on top of it and just wait for it to refresh. But it's not the quickest at filling up your health bar, unfortunately. All right, and then lastly, the patrol ward. Patrol ward is a strange trap. It does not actually stop spawning for husks that are going to spawn near tornadoes. So as you're doing missions, or if you're doing your home shield defense, you'll note that the map will end up getting marked with a bunch of little tornadoes that indicate where the husks are going to spawn. This trap does not actually stop spawning at any one of those tornadoes. What this does do is, and you'll see this at higher level missions, once you start getting into about 23 and above, some at 19, but not as many, is that the maps will start to, especially urban maps, in my experience, will start to have a lot more what are called patrols, which are just as you're walking around the map and you're collecting materials, these patrols will spawn and then walk across the map, and a lot of times they'll find you and engage you. So what this trap does is it basically provides you an amount of time during which the patrols cannot spawn. So it gives you a little bit of peace and quiet in order to do your work. You'll note, though, that it has a pretty low durability. Reload time on it is great. So basically, anytime the game would ordinarily spawn a patrol within this trap's area of effect, it'll just cancel it out, and the patrol doesn't spawn at all. But it does have a pretty low durability, and I think you'll find that when you're in a map that these traps will wear out pretty quickly, because the number of patrols that want to spawn are pretty high, especially as you get up there towards the higher end maps. But still, it's great for providing you a little bit of peace and quiet if you're wanting to just either build or gather materials for a little while. All right, the last three types of traps you'll notice cannot be upgraded. They're just basic traps that are provided to you. You actually unlock these as you're going through the missions. You don't actually have to buy them or pay for them or anything like that. The first one is the defender post, and this is basically a trap. You place it very much like you would a trap, but then what this allows you to do is it allows you to actually place a defender on top of you. Notice it has no stats whatsoever, because this trap itself doesn't actually do anything on its own. This just becomes basically like the home tile for a defender that you can place. There are two different types of defender squads, and I'll show you where those are as we go all the way back out. On squads, the first one is on your defender squad. So these are, and you'll actually have to slot them and unlock the positions separately through your skill and research trees. But then, so for example, on Stonewood, I've only gotten through shield level 6, but I've also only unlocked 3 of these tiles because, in my opinion, defenders are worthless as they currently have been implemented. They burn through gun durability far too fast. They are not very accurate, and they use ammo up very, very quickly. So I find it far more effective either just to shoot the husks myself or to use actual traps instead. But in any case, if I were doing Stonewood, I have 3 defenders slotted, so I could put 3 of those defender traps down and place 3 of these 3 defenders out, and they would then roam around within the area that I've given them, and they would roam around and shoot husks that they can see. There's another type, which is, if you look on your Heroes tab, these mission defenders. So if you're doing an offensive mission, not in your Storm Shield, these defenders can be used when you're building up, for example, to defend a Ride the Lightning or Storm Laser, I forget what they're actually called. So you could place these for offensive missions as well. I slot them in here because I've got them. I actually do not use them. All right, the last 2 traps that we've got are basically movement traps. They help you get around your base quicker, get around builds quicker. And essentially the first one is the directional jump pad. And so as you approach this pad, depending on the direction that you're facing, it will simply launch you in that direction straight ahead. So I'm going to do this. And you can see I managed to double launch. When you're using these, make sure that you are pointed in the direction that you want to go, so that you actually land where you want to go. Okay, the second type of trap is this trap right here. Very similar, but it basically just knocks a player straight up into the air, and then you can move around a little bit. So for example, as I'm approaching this, I can push forward and move up into the air a little bit. One cool thing about these traps is it does appear that no matter how far you fall, after using one of these traps, you do not take any falling damage. And so let me demonstrate here a little better with a floor trap. A directional pass, I'll put down a... So one pretty cool thing about these directional traps is it does appear that you cannot take falling damage after having used one. So for example, if I take this and go flying way down here, ordinarily this would have done a ton of damage and killed me, but as you can see by using the directional pad first, I'm just fine. Alright, and that's it for traps. I will definitely keep this updated. If anything else pops up, I will post any changes.